Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wilson. Today we're going to talk about how to produce a news piece. First of all, a news piece is completely different from a scripted production in that it's not scripted. Obviously, news pieces are based on real life and real life isn't scripted. So therefore, you're only going to need one piece of pre-production. That's it, the news piece pre-production sheet. Since you only have this one sheet, you need to make sure that you do it completely and well. You need to fill out the back and you need to make sure it is completely filled out and done well, because this is part of your grade, your pre-production. Now with the scripted production, it's script, storyboard, all of that stuff. For this, it's only this, so it needs to be done really well. You also need to make sure you read the front before you fill out the back. I can tell when people haven't because there are questions on the back like, what is your angle? And my students say, what does that mean? The answer is on the front. Okay, so you need to make sure you read this. There are requirements, instructions, and concepts that you need to know before doing your news piece. In fact, the first time you do a news piece, you'll obviously read it. The second, third, fourth times you'll do news pieces, you should skim it to make sure you remember everything. Now, the fat P of the news piece. What does fat P stand for again? We should know this. Form, audience, topic, purpose. Whenever you communicate to an audience in whatever form, you need to think about form, audience, topic, purpose. So what are our form, audience, topic, purpose in the case of the news piece? Your audience obviously is the school. It's also me, but since this is a more realistic project, it's going out to the entire school, or hopefully it will. You need to make sure that the purpose is to inform. Now with our ad PSAs, the main purpose is to persuade, but the news pieces, the main purpose is to inform. We're not trying to persuade anyone necessarily with our news piece. The secondary purpose, as with the scripted productions with our ad PSAs, is to entertain. So we also need to keep that in mind. Try to make the news pieces entertaining. Now your topic. Your topic is whatever your news piece is about, obviously. Any interesting, exciting, unusual event happening here at Montgomery Blair or in the greater community abroad in Tacoma Park or Silver Spring is good for a news piece. So the more realistic your news piece is, the more real life it is. If you think about having a news piece about something outside the school building but within our community, that would be a great idea. For example, the rec center, something happening at the rec center, the Tacoma Park Farmers Market, the Tacoma Park Folk Festival. There are lots of folk festivals and things like that happening in our community. The downtown Silver Spring ice rink opening up for the season would be another. Anything going on in the outside general community would be a great idea also. But really, the main place for you to get your topics for your news pieces is info flow. Every single info flow announcement is a potential news piece. The difference makers is holding a Pennies for Patients news piece. There's going to be a We Will Rock You Club concert news piece. Every single info flow announcement is a potential news piece. So if you're thinking about topics, just listen to info flow. Now, what's the form or the format? It's a news piece. It's going to be a short video, quite clearly. And as with any good piece of communication, there are going to be three segments: introduction, body, conclusion. Or as you would learn in a Communications 101 class, you're going to tell your audience what you're going to tell them, you're going to tell it to them, and then you're going to tell them what you told them. Your introduction is going to be what we call a stand-up of your reporter with a microphone giving the introduction in a relevant location if possible. It's important that it's a relevant location if you can, instead of just the hallway. If it's about the first day of school, stand in front of the school building. If it's about the Science Expo, stand in front of a sign for the Science Expo. So try to find a relevant location. You'll give the 5 W's, just like the first paragraph of a news piece, of a news article will have the 5 W's. Who, what, where, when, and why. Those are the basics that you're going to give in your introduction. Now your introduction and your conclusion should be shot while you're getting B-roll or interviews. I don't want students to go shoot just the stand-up introduction or conclusion just on its own. That's really a waste of time. You should do it while you're shooting B-roll or your interviews. If you don't, what you can do is do a voiceover with your introduction over what we'll call B-roll, which is pertinent images and video of the event you are covering. This would mean that you'd need enough B-roll to cover not only your interviews, but also your introduction as well. After the introduction is the body. The body of your news piece is going to be the interviews that you have collected with what we call B-roll over top of them. So we would see an interview of Miss Deanie talking about the back to school night, and we would see, after we see her first, we would see footage of back to school night. That's the body of your news piece. You need at least 2 interviews in your news piece, which means you should interview at least 4 people. Because what if one of your interviews is a dud, which can happen, especially when you're interviewing a student and they just give you yes, no questions. If you do that, you should be like, that was not a good interview, we need more. When you're shooting your interviews, you should be able to figure out, was that a good interview or not? Was there some good things that we can use from that interview or not? Sometimes students don't figure that out until they get back and look at their footage and editing and say, oh, we don't have a very good interview. You should be thinking about that, listening to your interview as you're shooting it. The 2 interviews should be 2 different types of people. So obviously, the news pieces in a school, one of them is usually going to be a student. The other could be a teacher, or it could be a participant of the event and an observer of the event, or a sponsor of the event. If you got 6 or 7 interviews, that wouldn't be too much. That would be great because, as I will say and as you will learn, the more options you have, the better. There's almost no such thing as too many interviews or too much B-roll. Of course, if you got 100 interviews, that would be a hard time going through all those interviews to find the best pieces. Because of course, you're not going to include the entire interview. You're going to go through your interviews and pick the best sound bites, which is a term we should be familiar with, to place in your interview. Don't just take an entire piece of interview and throw it down into your news piece. You want to take the little teeny sound bites that are the best pieces. If something's not relevant, don't include it. Again, more choices applies to B-roll. You want to get as many images as possible. When you shoot, you should think especially about insert shots. Not only longer shots of events and medium shots of people at the events, but close-ups, inserts of different items that have to do with the event. Posters, flyers, if there's a stand of something, close-ups of the things that are on the stand, a table set up at an event, close-ups of the things that are on that table. You can also use still images from the web gathered from online. Another requirement that you will have for your second and third and beyond news pieces is, in your body you will have to have a voiceover done by a reporter giving some additional information that's not included in your interviews or your introduction. It only has to be 1 sentence long or 2, and it has to be some information that we didn't hear in your interviews or your introduction. If you have trouble coming up with ideas, you can ask Mr. Wilson. Another requirement will be that you'll have to have a montage in your news piece that is synced to the music, which means you're going to have some extra B-roll for that, because that's going to be not over interviews, not over the voiceover, just a short montage of images over the music. It only needs to be a 4-image montage. It can be longer, and it needs to be synced to the music. The last part of your news piece is, of course, the conclusion. This is simply the reporter doing another stand-up, usually in the same location, usually shot at the same time as the introduction, doesn't have to be, saying something as simple as you can see, blank was a great success. This is reporter's name, first name only for
info flow.
If you want to be a little bit more original, you could say something like, as you can see, the
Montgomery Blair is equivalent to Tacoma Park Middle School's Turkey Trot.
Continues to be a great event here
Montgomery Blair
for students to get out and run and have fun and show school spirit, or something a little bit more involved, which would be nice, but not necessary. But you do have to have that conclusion. The conclusion also could be done as a voiceover. Now we need to talk about your interviews. First, your interview should almost always be shot as medium close-up profiles, just like we get them in our scripted productions, with good headroom, nose room, seeing both eyes right below the chest. This can be broken in case we have something that we need to see in your interviews that is part of your shot. If someone's standing next to a Science Expo board, then we need to see that Science Expo board, or we'd like to see that Science Expo board, we could get a longer shot. If they're standing next to a display or a sign or something, we could get a longer shot. But the majority of your interviews will be a medium close-up profile. We do not need to see the reporter at all. In order to prepare the person you're interviewing for the interview, you should always, if you have time, tell them the questions that you're going to ask them before you ask them. That way they've heard the question, even if it's only maybe 30 seconds before you ask them on film. So sometimes when you ask someone a question for the first time and they have a microphone stuck in their mouth, they'll usually go, so you don't want that. You'd like them to have some sort of response already thought up. So tell them the questions. Here are the 4 questions we're going to ask you before you start to shoot. Another good thing to do is to tell them to try to speak in complete sentences and restate the question as part of your answer, because we want to, as much as possible, edit out the questions. We don't need to hear the reporter's questions unless the answer doesn't make sense with them. So if you ask Mr. Little, why do you like to run We Will Rock You Club? And he remembers and says, I like to run We Will Rock You Club because it's a great way for students to express creativity. You don't need the question. You will edit that out because he answered in complete sentences, restating the question as part of the answer. If they don't do that, that's okay. Don't stop and say, you didn't do it. That's okay. If they can remember to try to do that, that's great. If they don't, that's okay. Teachers will usually remember. Students often won't. That's okay. Don't stop the interview. And you don't need to do an interview more than once. 2 takes is only for scripted productions. An interview, 1 take, and that's it. The only time you'll do it again is if the interviewer, the person you're interviewing says, I'd really like to do that again. Then you can do it again. If you want to do it again, it's okay, but really you should have prepared so you don't have to shoot more than 1 take. If there's a problem with students joking around and you need more takes, just stop the interview. If they're not being serious, don't interview that student. Of course, they can joke around in appropriate ways, in ways that you might use in your news piece, but if they're just being completely crazy and out of hand, just stop the interview and go on to the next person. Another thing is your reporter holds the microphone. Do not let the person you're interviewing grab the microphone and talk into it. This is your microphone. Even if it's
Miss Johnson
or a teacher and they go to grab the microphone, just politely inform them, no, I'm sorry, I'm the reporter, this is my microphone, I'm going to hold it. Also inform them that they should be looking at you and not the camera. Again, if they do look at the camera, that's okay. You can keep it, you can use it, but it's better if they're looking at the reporter and not at the camera. You will have 4 prepared questions for all of your interviews. And they should be open-ended questions. In other words, questions that can't be answered by yes or no or a 1-word answer. Now, a good reporter is not only going to go through question 1, question 2, question 3, question 4, that's it. A good reporter is going to listen to the answers and ask follow-up questions if they think they can find some. Oh, really? What was that like? Or tell me more about that experience. Remember, the more material you have, the better your production is going to be because you have more to choose from. So the reporter shouldn't simply only ask the 4 prepared questions, but think about follow-up questions or additional questions based on the answers that are being given. Besides the 4 prepared questions, you will always ask the same first question and last question of all of your interviews. The first question you will always ask is, can you please state and spell your first and last name? The reason we do that is so we have their first and last name for the lower third, which will appear on the screen. A lower third is something like this that says the person's name and what they do. If you don't do that, you don't know their names, that's not good. You really shouldn't include them in your news piece. Now, if you know the person's first and last name, you don't need to ask if you know the spelling. If it's your friend and you know it, great. If it's someone you're not sure of the spelling, ask, okay? But it's important we ask that first question, almost always, unless you know the person's first and last name spelling. The last question will be, do you have anything else to add? It's important that you always ask that question, even with students, because students 99% of the time will say, no. That's fine. They can say no. A teacher or an adult will often have additional information that they would like to share that they didn't get a chance to while you're interviewing them. If they don't, again, that's okay, but always ask that last question. Do you have anything else you'd like to add? Please make sure you ask that first question and last question for all of your interviews. Another important thing is not to handle the microphone too much. Now, if I go like this on the microphone, I'm handling a lot, you can't hear anything, right? You don't hear anything. But what I'm going to do now is plug this in so you can hear the sound from this microphone, and you'll see that handling it is not a good thing. So now we're getting audio from this microphone, and it should sound fairly good, unless I start going like this. Now you should hear that that doesn't sound too good. And of course, you might not be handling it this much, but a lot of people will ask a question and then get the answer and go and hold and mess around with the microphone. So try only to just hold the microphone in your hand and don't handle it too much. Even the cord sometimes will, if you mess with the cord, you'll get sound from it. So don't do that. The microphone I'm using right now, by the way, is a lav mic, a lavalier mic, which is pinned to my chest. We're not usually going to be using lav mics for productions in my classroom. If you perhaps do a documentary, which you might if you take my class for 3 or 4 semesters, then you'd probably want to use a lav mic, because if you've seen a documentary, interviews usually aren't done with microphones, but people sitting in an office setting or something like that, giving their answers, and they're mic'd with a lav mic. But normally we're going to be using this microphone for our news pieces and the internal microphone for our scripted productions. Now, if you do a production that's outside the school, you may find yourself shooting on your own camera or perhaps on a phone. These phones are great cameras, and so if you need to do some shooting on the fly, a phone is a great option. One thing you have to remember when you're shooting on a phone is to make sure you're shooting in landscape mode. Never shoot video in portrait mode. Never. Now, sometimes you'll see video online that's shot in portrait mode. That's because those people are amateurs. They don't know what they're doing. That's okay. Oftentimes you'll see when things are captured online and put online, people shoot this way. They don't know what they're doing. That's okay. You know better, or at least now you do. Always shoot video in landscape. Always. Even when you're taking pictures and not video, really most of them should be in landscape mode instead of portrait mode. And one reason you can think about that is if you get a camera, an actual camera, it's like this, and people take pictures like this. Sometimes they'll go like this to take a picture, and that's okay to take a portrait picture, but usually they take pictures like this. So that's something to keep in mind. Usually you'll want to take pictures like this, especially if you're taking pictures for use in video. You don't want pictures that are in portrait mode for import into a video. Then you'll have huge black bars on the side. Looks ugly. Now, if you're shooting interviews on a phone, you're not going to have a dedicated microphone, which means audio is something you need to really think about. If you're shooting interviews on a phone or on a camera that doesn't have a dedicated microphone, you need to think about a few things. One, get that person in a place that does not have a lot of ambient sound. Oftentimes my students will film on their own camera or phone at something like a convention, and they'll film that interview right in the convention hall. You can't hear what they're saying. If you can't hear what your interview is saying, it's wasted. You can't use it. So one, get them into a place that doesn't have a lot of ambient noise. Two, get close. Make sure you're at least a medium close-up, or in this case, that might be an instance to get a little closer, because the microphone is on your phone. The closer that microphone is, the better. Of course, you don't want to go to an extreme close-up, but a close-up with just a little shoulders might be good. And then three, tell them to speak loudly and clearly, because you're not using a dedicated microphone. And then you should have good audio to use for your interviews. And if you're shooting on your own with a phone or a camera, you'll still do all the things we'll do here in school. Namely, ask them to state and spell their first and last name, ask them the 4 prepared, open-ended questions, thinking of follow-up questions if you can, ask them if they have anything else to add, tell them the questions beforehand so they have some time to think about it, and ask them to, if they can, try to answer, restating the question as part of their answer and in complete sentences. A few last notes. A title and a reinforcing message are not needed in news pieces. You can have a title if you'd like. You could even have a reinforcing message, but they're not necessary. I want these news pieces to look as much like a news package that you see on the nightly news as possible. They don't have titles, or reinforcing message. They also don't have transitions, so don't include transitions. No fades or wipes or dissolves. And lastly, try to make it entertaining. Don't cross the line, make fun of people, or make fun of the topic you're covering, but try to make it entertaining in creative and interesting ways. Because your primary purpose, of course, is to inform. Your secondary purpose is to entertain, so when people watch it,
Info flow.
they go, oh, that's good, that was good, that was a good news piece, I really enjoyed it. So those are the things we need to think about when making a news piece. Good luck.